The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to review the fiscal year 2022 budget request for the Department of Homeland Security. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. This gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coburn, shall assume the duties of the chair in event I run into any technical difficulties. Before we begin, in light of the Speaker's revised pandemic policy announcement on Monday, I want to take the opportunity to commit to working with the ranking member to ensure an orderly and, most importantly, safe return to in-person committee operations once the House is no longer in a declared public health emergency pursuant to House Resolution 8. The health and welfare of members, witnesses, and staff should not be a political issue, and I look forward to returning to in-person committee hearings soon. With that, I welcome the members and our witness, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, to today's hearing. Secretary Mayorkas testified before the committee in March regarding the way forward for the department, and we were pleased to have him here today to discuss DHS's 2022 budget request. Overall, the Biden administration is requesting $52 billion for DHS, roughly equal to the FY 2021 funding level. Though there is always room for improvement, the administration's request will provide the department with the resources necessary to meet its diverse and ever-evolving mission. The request prioritizes funding to improve federal cybersecurity, respond to heightened domestic terrorism threats, and enhance border capabilities. It invests in creating a fairer and more equitable immigration system, preparing local communities for the effects of natural disasters, and revitalizing the department's research and development capabilities. It further seeks to strengthen national resiliency in these critical areas. Many of these Homeland Security priorities were all but ignored by the last administration. I'm pleased the Biden administration is giving these matters the attention and resources they demand. Members will have questions for you, Mr. Secretary, about areas where additional resources will be necessary, such as the Homeland Security grants to states and local governments and cybersecurity funding given recent cyber attacks. Be assured, we will be engaging the administration on these funding needs as the appropriation process moves forward. Beyond the budget, the committee looks forward to working with the department on a range of pressing legislative and policy matters. For example, we look forward to working with the administration, completing the nomination process for the department and seeing competent Senate-confirmed individuals leading DHS's components, agencies, and offices once again. I urge you, Mr. Secretary, to help ensure these remaining nominees reflect the diversity of the Homeland Department you seek to secure. With respect to legislation, we are ready to help to bring about the transformational reforms you outlined for the TSA workforce earlier this month. That meaning enacting H.R. 903, the Rights for TSA Workforce Act, to provide better pay and protections to workforce that has steadfastly protected our transportation system, even in the face of government shutdowns and COVID. I also believe that we can come together to bolster cybersecurity. For 4 years, we struggled with the lack of consistent leadership from the White House on cybersecurity issues, and late last year, the chickens came home to roost as the Russians infiltrated federal networks with a sophisticated supply chain attack. More recently, the country felt the effects of a series of ransomware attacks, including the attack on Colonial Pipeline. From day one, the Biden administration has sought to improve federal network defenses, better manage supply chain risk, and work with the private sector to improve cybersecurity across critical infrastructure sectors. Much more must be done to provide funding, personnel, and authorities to address this growing threat. Increasingly, we see growing support for changes in the law to require reporting of certain ransomware attacks and cyber intrusions, particularly when the operation of critical infrastructure systems are implicated. With your partnership, Mr. Secretary, I think we can get there. I also think we can help shore up cybersecurity at the state and local level by ensuring dedicated grant funding is available, as the committee seeks to do with H.R. 3138, the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act. Beyond these two areas, with your engagement, we have an opportunity to put the department on a far better footing in addressing its longstanding morale, acquisition, and management challenges in a comprehensive bill. With respect to policy matters, I want to commend the administration's release this week of the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, a promise the president made on day one in the wake of the events of January 6th. We look forward to examining the strategy in both depth and hearing more detail from the DHS, the intelligence community, and the other agencies tasked with the important work and the bold plans they have to implement the strategic vision that President Biden has set forth. Finally, I'd note that you join us today, Mr. Secretary, straight from your trip to Mexico this week, where you engage your counterparts on border security and facilitation matters. Your visit followed Vice President Harris's recent trip to Mexico and Central America to work with government leaders on addressing root causes of migration. More remains to be done, but I'm pleased the Biden administration is doing the hard work necessary to address the situation at the border for the long term, while prioritizing a more secure border and more humane immigration system today. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here, and the committee looks forward to working with you on these critical issues and positioning DHS for success in all its missions. With that, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that the committee is holding this hearing to examine President Biden's 2022 budget request. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking time to appear before the committee today. Mr. Secretary, a lot has happened in Homeland since you first appeared before this committee back in March. Unfortunately, a lot of it has been anything but encouraging. So I look forward to talking about those challenges and how we can work together. I also hope to soon be conducting these hearings in person, and I'm very encouraged by I'm very encouraged by to have these hearings in person. I'm also very encouraged that the chairman has noted that that's going to be happening soon. Today, we have a full complement of Republican members here who are ready to make room on the dais and work alongside our Democratic colleagues to conduct the important work of this committee in a bipartisan manner. Mr. Secretary, I don't envy the job you have today. The president has submitted the largest budget request by far in the history of the United States, $6 trillion. Sadly, if this fiscally irresponsible budget is enacted, our children and our children's children, at a minimum, will be paying for it, a burden we should not place on future generations. And despite its high price tag, this budget request is out of touch with reality and, more importantly, fails to prioritize many of today's most pressing Homeland Security threats. To give you a few examples, the Department of Homeland Security is asking for $76 million for electric vehicles, but there are no additional appropriations requested for new Border Patrol agents. And CBP's net discretionary budget has a reduction of $280 million. Overall, the fiscal year 2022 budget asks for less than 0.5% of an increase for three key Homeland Security law enforcement components: Customs and Border Patrol, ICE, and the Coast Guard. When proposed funding for pay increases is set aside, these three agencies show a decrease from their enacted levels in their fiscal year 2022 requests. On the cyber front, the budget requests a 29% increase for the Department of Energy cyber activities, but only a 6% increase for CISA. The Biden budget simply fails to reflect the priorities that are critical to the defense of the homeland. And so I do not envy you having to come before the committee and defend this request on behalf of the administration. Honestly, just don't know how it is possible to spend that much money on a grab bag full of far-left proposals while somehow neglecting to adequately defend the homeland, particularly given the rash of major cyber attacks we've had recently. Mr. Secretary, unfortunately, since you were last before the committee, the crisis at the border has not gotten better. In fact, it is trending worse. Just last week, Customs and Border Patrol announced that over 180,000 migrants were encountered along the southwest border in the month of May alone, including 121,000 single adults, over 44,600 family units, and over 14,000 unaccompanied minors. We have also become numb to these numbers, but they continue to be staggering. The 180,000 number represents a 675% increase. And let me say that again, 675% increase from May of 2020. Despite these numbers, by eliminating border wall funding, President Biden is allowing cartels, smugglers, criminals, and traffickers to continue exploiting the border. And sadly, neither the president nor the vice president has even bothered to visit the border. In fact, in a recent interview, Vice President Harris laughed off the idea, even though, in theory, President Biden has put her in charge of the crisis. This is not a laughing matter. One aspect of this crisis that has been highlighted and truly makes every state a border state is the explosion of illegal drugs that have been streaming across the border. This particularly impacts my district in central New York and so many other communities across this country. According to Customs and Border Patrol, drug seizures were up 18% in May from April of 2021. Methamphetamine seizures were up 53%. Heroin seizures were up, and so was fentanyl. There's been enough fentanyl to cross the border this year already to kill every man, woman, and child in the United States. Try and digest that. Customs and Border Patrol continues to see an alarming surge in fentanyl seizures at 56% higher than May of 2021, than all of through May of 2021 through, let me rephrase that, which are 56% higher through May of fiscal year 21 than all of fiscal year 20. This means that more than 600 pounds of deadly fentanyl was seized every month for the last 12 months, and that is a record. In the last 6 months alone, Border Patrol seized 5,400 pounds of fentanyl, enough lethal doses to kill 1.2 billion people, or the entire population of the United States more than 3 times over. More than 90,000 Americans died of overdoses between September 2019 and September 2020. Last year, drug overdose deaths rose by more than 27% in New York State alone. That's completely unacceptable, and Homeland Republicans will continue pressuring the administration to reverse its disastrous executive orders and work with us on stronger border security measures. Mr. Secretary, the last time you were here, I stated that I did not want to be a bomb thrower, but wanted to work with you on solutions, and that offer remains. I have introduced several bipartisan bills, including HR 2321, that would require Homeland Security and federal partners to establish an agile plan to respond to irregular migration surges with benchmarks in place for activation. This legislation has received bipartisan support in the Senate, and a Senate companion is coming soon. I would ask that you look at this legislation, as I believe it is a common sense approach to at least our frontline law enforcement and management the crisis at the border. While the president's request makes modest increases to CISA's budget, CISA needs sustained, robust funding to carry out its mission and nimbly respond to evolving threats. In the past 6 months, CISA has worked to mitigate multiple significant cyber incidents facing federal networks, as well as a sharp increase in devastating ransomware attacks on our nation's critical infrastructure. Unfortunately, ransomware attacks are becoming a more pervasive threat, and I feel that we as a country continue to fall further and further behind, and we continue to play defense instead of being on offense when we're at our strongest. I'm concerned that the president's budget included a sharper increase for other federal cybersecurity efforts, but not CISA, especially given the attacks CISA is tasked to defend. How can CISA be expected to continue to address these cyber threats head-on with such a small budget, given that the global financial impact of these cyber attacks amounts to over $1 trillion annually? Try to digest that. Over $1 trillion annually is the cost of these cyber attacks, and we're not really doing much about it with CISA. You have also acknowledged that CISA needs to be the quarterback of the .gov domain, and I appreciate that. And I fully agree, but this budget fails to do that. I believe that CISA needs to be a $5 billion agency in 5 years, and that is not going to happen with meager increases like you propose in this budget. I look forward to hearing from the Secretary today, but like I said, I do not envy his job. This budget proposal manages to somehow be incredibly bloated while at the same time lack the funding we need to protect the homeland. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. Again, I welcome our witness, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Without objections, the Secretary's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask Secretary Mayorkas to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, and distinguished members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you again today. The 240,000 public servants in the Department of Homeland Security are confronting increasingly complex and dynamic threats. We have a broad mission set, and my dedicated colleagues across the department are up to the challenges we face. As we will discuss in more detail today, it is the resources afforded by this Congress that will help ensure we can continue to effectively meet our mission and recruit and retain our nation's most talented professionals. I welcome this opportunity to discuss several key agency priorities for fiscal year 2022 set forth in the President's budget for the Department of Homeland Security. First, the President's budget provides for more effective and modern port and border security, including a $655 million investment towards modernizing our land ports of entry. At our ports of entry, the budget includes an additional $47 million to integrate Customs and Border Protection detection capabilities, in addition to investments in border surveillance technology. Notably, there is no request for additional border wall construction. The budget reflects the President's commitment to rebuilding our immigration system into one that is fair, efficient, and upholds our nation's values and our laws. It includes a new discretionary request for $345 million for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to tackle our backlog of applications and petitions and to support up to 125,000 refugee admissions per year. To ensure the safe and humane treatment of migrants at the southwest border, the request includes $163 million for medical needs for those in Customs and Border Protection custody. In recognition of the growing threat of cyber attacks against both the public and private sectors, the President is requesting new resources for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which leads DHS and interagency efforts to defend against today's threats and promote cyber resilience. It provides $2.1 billion for cyber activities, which builds on the $650 million already provided to CISA in the American Rescue Plan to respond to government-wide breaches and boost cyber defenses. It will also allow CISA to enhance its cybersecurity tools, hire qualified experts, and obtain support services to protect and defend critical infrastructure and federal information technology systems. In recent years, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has stepped up to confront increasingly costly, devastating, and frequent natural disasters. FEMA has also taken the lead in our efforts to deliver and expand access to COVID-19 vaccines. As a result, the agency helped to vaccinate more than 5 million people and helped stand up more than 1,000 community vaccination centers. I am grateful for their efforts on both of these fronts, especially as they focus on addressing the existential threat of climate change. The budget invests $532 million above the fiscal year 2021 enacted level to confront climate change in an equitable way, including significant investments in pre-disaster planning, climate resilience grant programs, and FEMA's workforce. Finally, under the Biden-Harris administration, our department has made it a top priority to address domestic terrorism, which is the most lethal and persistent terrorism-related threat to the United States today. The fiscal year 2022 discretionary request includes $131 million to support innovative methods to prevent domestic terrorism while respecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. It also supports critical research on the root causes of radicalization, enhanced community outreach, and funding for locally driven efforts. I am honored to support and represent the dedicated DHS workforce. Their commitment to the dynamic Homeland Security mission is unwavering, and I vow to do everything in my authority as Secretary to ensure they are resourced, compensated, and recognized appropriately. On behalf of the department, I ask for your continued support in providing the resources we need to meet our critical mission. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to discussing the President's FY22 budget priorities for the department, and I welcome your questions today. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary for his testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witness. I now recognize myself for such question. Mr. Secretary, when you last testified before the committee in March, you stated you'd certainly be reviewing the events that led up to the horrible day of January 6th. Since then, DHS has been assessing its capabilities to address domestic terrorism and prevent a January 6th-like attack from happening again. And just this week, the Biden administration, as you said in your opening statement, released the nation's first national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, which tasked DHS and other agencies with the important work of combating this persistent threat. What is the status of your review into what happened on January 6th as it relates to DHS?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We have indeed reviewed the events that led up to the tragic events of January 6th, and our review is ongoing. I think that we are predicated on 3 pillars of our work to combat domestic terrorism. Number 1, we base it on intelligence and information gathered by law enforcement. We are data-driven. Number 2, we are focused on ensuring that while we do this critical work, we protect civil rights, civil liberties, and the rights of privacy of each member of the American public. And third, and importantly, that we are ideology neutral, that we look at any ideology, false narrative, myth and disinformation with respect to ideologies of hate and radicalization, and critically, and this is what is a distinguishing factor, their connectivity to violence, regardless of the politics of any ideology, and that we address it. This has been a long-standing challenge, and I note, for example, the 2017 attack on Republican members of Congress at our baseball stadium, and it is vitally important that we keep that principle in mind, that we are ideology neutral, and we are focused on the connectivity to violence, which is unacceptable in our country.
Thank you very much. As you know, the majority of members who come to Washington do so by air. And I've heard from flight attendants and others in the airline industry about the alarming uptick in unruly passenger incidents aboard planes in the last year. And some of these episodes have included violent assaults on flight attendants and TSA officers. I'm gravely concerned that this number of such incidents is on the rise. What is DHS doing to address the situation and address problems on the ground before they become problems in the air?
Mr. Chairman, I share your view that this violence is intolerable and will not be accepted. We have communicated quite clearly that the mask mandate that governs the conduct of individuals in our modes of transportation and in the air is a federal mandate, and I've communicated that from different airports around our country. We also have prepared federal air marshals to address any act of violence that they themselves observe while on flights. And importantly, we are working with law enforcement to ensure that these acts are met with the full force of federal law, which is applicable to acts of violence in the air. And these individuals who commit these heinous acts will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law.
I look forward to it. There is some question about air marshals getting involved if they are on the plane. I'd like to further that conversation with you. Lastly, our workforce, we passed a bill, HR 8993, the Department of Homeland Security Intelligence and Cybersecurity Diversity Fellowship Program, but there's no money in the budget for it this year. Diversity of the workforce is important. I look forward to working with you on seeing where we can identify some resources that can support that program.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that is a core value of this administration and our department in it, to ensure that the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion are fully realized, and you have my commitment.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, just to follow up on what Mr. Thompson just said, if that's one of your core values and one of your core priorities, diversity, why isn't there any funding for it in the budget?
Ranking Member Katko, it is incumbent upon us to use the authorities that we have, the recruiting, hiring, and retention authorities that we have to achieve those objectives. We are implementing programs and practices within our existing budget authority to ensure that the diversity of our workforce, including the diversity of our leadership, reflects the diversity of the American public we serve.
I think it's fair to say that if you had more funding for it, if you had some funding for it, it would enhance that even better. Let's go on to another question here. CISA. I appreciate your comments about being CISA should be the quarterback of the .gov domain and the quarterback of cybersecurity in the federal government. I think you and I agree on that. I mean, you and I agree on a lot of things with respect to CISA. So let me ask you this very simple and question to ask. It warrants a very brief response. Do you believe CISA should be up to about a $5 billion agency in the not too distant future?
I think it is very important to resource CISA fully. Mr. Ranking Member, you and I do agree on the mission of CISA, its criticality, as well as funding its future. We have to make sure that the additional funds that we receive are expended wisely, efficiently, and effectively. We have requested additional funds for CISA. We so greatly appreciate your support, this committee's support, and Congress's support for the additional money we've already received for that agency.
Mr. Secretary, you admit, would you not, that CISA is completely overwhelmed with the amount of work they have right now?
I would not say that. I would say we are extraordinarily busy. We are incredibly focused on this, one of our most critical, urgent priorities, the cybersecurity of our nation.
I understand, sir. Thank you, sir. We got several other questions to ask you. But given the gravity of the situation, given my discussions with folks at CISA, it's clear to me that they need more resources. And I would ask you to reconsider and speak to the administration about plussing this up. We're going to have to do this in the appropriations process. You are the one that's going to be the guy that's going to be the cheerleader for CISA. And a 6% increase, given what's going on with cybersecurity in this country right now, just isn't cutting the mustard. So I would respectfully ask you to do that. Now, with respect to,
if I may, I'm incredibly proud to serve as the cheerleader for CISA, and I am undaunted and unrelenting in that regard.
Well, then give more money, and that would help. With regard to the Customs and Border Patrol, is it correct that there's not additional Border Patrol agents scheduled in this budget request?
Mr. Ranking Member, U.S. Customs and Border Protection is seeking to invest significantly in port modernization and technology,
I understand
innovative
that.
technology.
Sir, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm asking just a straight question. Does the budget contemplate hiring more Customs and Border Patrol agents?
It does, it does not. We have vacancies now. We are very focused on recruiting and hiring additional personnel.
Understood. Thank you. But the bottom line is, if you go to the border, you will know that many phenomena are happening. There's a retirement rate is very alarming right now, and it's increasing because of what's going on at the border. And we have a 21-year high in Border Patrol agents being pulled from all over the country to deal with the crisis at the border. And it would seem to me that'd be a good time for us to contemplate plussing up Border Patrol. One last question for you, if I may, sir. You were a prosecutor before you took this job. You prosecuted cases, you tried cases, is that right?
For 12 years, I served as an assistant United States attorney and the United States attorney for the Central District of California.
I'm a former AUSA as well, and I'm sure you'll agree it's the best job you can ever have. But in that capacity, did you ever go to the crime scene? Did you ever go to a crime scene and kind of so you can get in your head to see what happened with the crime so they could then prosecute it?
I think you may recall, since we both served as assistant United States attorneys, that it is critically important that a federal prosecutor that is bringing a case not serve as a witness. And so it was our office policy not, in fact, to observe a crime scene, to rely on the brave and extraordinary federal agents, as well as state and local law enforcement, who did the investigative work, and we focused on our prosecution mission.
I'm not talking about when a crime was going on or whatever, just going back and surveying to get an eye and see what happened. You never did that?
Ranking Member Katko, I did not, and my record of success as a federal prosecutor speaks for itself.
Okay, well, I'm not questioning that at all. Obviously, it was successful. Okay, well,
Ranking Member's time has expired.
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes. Gentlelady is having technical difficulties. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana for 5 minutes, Mr. Higgins.
I'm back.
Mr. Chair, was I recognized, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you are.
On.
Gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm appreciative of the recognition. Today's hearing should be one of the most significant hearings in Congress. We face unbelievable and unprecedented challenge on our southern border.
So
We are speaking with the one man that leads the Department of Homeland Security today, and we're going to question him about the budget that's been requested by our president. We recognize as American citizens that our nation is imperiled. Certainly that imperiled status is a threat from weak and agenda-driven policies by politicians who no longer recognize their service to we the people. And our southern border is absolutely the front line of defense for the sovereignty of our nation. And yet, America can expect no real answers today. What you're going to hear, my fellow citizens, is scripted, rehearsed speeches. Mr. Mayorkas is not going to answer Republican questions. He's made that clear. He is absolutely going to echo the talking points of the Biden administration and the Democrat majority. So let's ask about that. Mr. Mayorkas, have you or your staff coordinated with the Democrat majority members of the Homeland Security Committee or the Homeland Security Committee majority staff regarding your responses to questions you'll receive today and your answers? Have you coordinated that, Mr. Mayorkas?
Congressman Higgins, I conduct my responsibilities and fulfill my duties to the American public
Bingo.
in a
Exactly
bipartisan
as I advised.
in a
You're not
bipartisan
going to answer
manner.
my question.
I've had the pleasure and the privilege of speaking
Finish
with members on both sides of the aisle prior to my testimony this morning.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Mayorkas. Thank you for making my point. I have a question that you're probably not prepared for. Mr. Mayorkas, you're in charge of defending our homeland. Let's dig into your true beliefs, sir. Do you believe that every square inch of American soil is sovereign and should be secured and protected?
Yes.
Every square inch. Is it
Yes.
sovereign and should be secured and protected? Simple
Yes.
question.
I answered yes.
Mr. Mayorkas, it's you lead DHS. Good sir. That's a pretty simple question. Do you believe that the answer is yes. All right. Do you believe that you are, as leader of Department of Homeland Security, do you believe that you're accomplishing that task right now?
We are.
My numbers say we have 1.1 million illegal crossings at our southern border. We're absolutely in crisis as a nation. You're in charge. How are we doing?
Congressman Higgins, I hope
You are.
I hope you heard the answers to your
I
questions.
turn my attention to the
Both of
American
them were-
citizenry again.
Both of them were affirmative.
This Mr. Mayorkas is completely making our point.
Mr. Higgins, I'm very, please allow the witness to answer the question.
Mr. Mayorkas,
Secretary,
you've been very
please answer your question.
today by
Congressman Higgins,
true attention to the crisis at our border. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, I had technical difficulties, or I should say Congressman Higgins had technical difficulties. It was very difficult to receive his questions. I don't know if he heard my answers. I answered his questions quite directly.
Yes, we heard him, and he's yielded his time. Chair recognizes again the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you again. Let me thank the administration for its humanitarian treatment of this very difficult question of immigration, unaccompanied children. Let me thank you for the work that you've done to reunite children that have been disastrously separated over the last 4 years, cruelly, as many of us have experienced those mothers and children not being reunited. Let me turn to CISR and the important work of cyber and cyber response. We're under attack. The President made it clear in his meeting with Mr. Putin yesterday. I want to ask, how is the Cyber Response Recovery Fund designed to function in concert with CISR in order to both prevent and respond to attacks on our critical infrastructure, such as in the case with SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline? And Mr. Secretary, as you well know, my time is short and I have several other questions. Delighted to welcome you.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for your support of CISA and its critical mission. That fund is very important to equip and enable victims of cyber attacks to recover from those attacks most swiftly in the service of the public-private partnership and the American public.
I think it is very important that either we as the Congress continues to increase that funding, but also I would encourage developing the expertise at DHS as well. Texas understands the challenge of climate crisis. Well, states and local governments that have a history of dealing with climate emergencies and are projected to continue this experience. Will they be able to be prioritized with competitive grants?
Congresswoman, yes, they will be, and we are taking a look at our FEMA grant programs, which are so critically important to disaster prevention, relief, recovery, and resilience, and the critical impacts of climate change on states' abilities to be prepared.
Transportation Security Administration has shown itself over and over again, and the TSOs, how they've been the front line of our security. Many of them were impacted by COVID-19. So the administration have a policy of trying to professionalize the TSA, TSOs for retention, and as well be able to support increased funding for that purpose. Number one. Number two, the department has security as its important point, but it also should have a commitment to civil rights, civil liberties. What is the process that occurs when a stakeholder reaches out to the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties? If you take the TSA question first.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We are dedicating to funding TSA workforce. I really applaud and embrace the chairman's dedication to that workforce. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I made a critical announcement about our commitment not only to provide collective bargaining rights to the TSA workforce, to the TSOs, but also to work towards ensuring that their pay is at a level, at least that level provided under Title V of the United States Code. So I share your commitment, and I really praise the chairman's leadership in this area. One of the critical things, if I may, turning to your second question, Madam Congresswoman, is practice that I have instituted in the Department of Homeland Security. Our statutorily created Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties does not engage at the end of our policy development and our processes and procedures, but at the very, very beginning. And that is critical to ensuring that the movements that we make, the decisions that we make, integrate that critical mission, set those values and principles on the front end of our work. And I look forward to working with you on that.
Very quickly, we know what is happening in the nation's airwaves, and the nation's airlines and the nation's skies. I heard you make a comment about marshals, and I'd be interested in adding their powers or their procedures and how we can ensure a safe travel for our traveling public who are civilians and who've been called into action as if they are staff or military to save the lives of the other traveling public.
I look forward to working with you on that, Congresswoman. I really applaud the tremendous work that our federal air marshals have done so very many years. I know of their work very well.
Thank you so very much. And I want to compliment FEMA. We were under siege, as all of us were, in COVID-19. They opened up several sites in the Texas area where the surge of COVID-19, we lost a lot of lives, but they were always there, and particularly during the very difficult and very unhelpful time of trying to get PPEs and other equipment prior to the vaccination. So thank you so very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us today and reviewing the information that you submitted to this committee. I see that in the category where you addresses challenges at the border, you state that the number of encounters at the border has been elevated. You go on to say this resulted in a substantial strain on the processing, transportation, and holding capacity of the U.S. Border Patrol. Later, you say as a result of the recent surge in unaccompanied children, this presents a serious challenge to DHS. I know you've made previous statements. Previously, I believe you said that we are on pace to encounter more individuals on the southwest border than we have in the last 20 years. Mr. Secretary, last time you were here, when questioned by Ranking Member Katko, he asked, given the tremendous rise and surge of individuals coming to the border, wouldn't it be fair to call this a crisis? Your response was, I'm not spending any time on the language that we use. I'm spending time on the operational response to the situation at the border. You make that, and then we see today a budget that has no increased funding for key frontline agencies. And so my first question to you, Mr. Secretary, is that when compiling these budget requests, did you consult with our state and local partners that we rely on so frequently as we attempt to secure our homeland?
Congressman, thank you so much for your question. I have most certainly engaged with state and local law enforcement throughout my 4-month tenure. I have done so regularly, not only with chiefs of police, but with sheriffs and on occasion rank and file, so that I understand what is being experienced on the ground and best able and equipped to respond to it most effectively. Most certainly I have engaged, and I will continue to do so. In fact, if I may, I have elevated the position that was in the prior administration a deputy assistant secretary for state and local law enforcement to the position of assistant secretary for state and local law enforcement. In addition to that, I designated an individual, a former chief of police, as a senior counselor to ensure that our engagement with state and local law enforcement is both as robust as possible and effective in implementing the policies and procedures that we are tasked to perform.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate that open line of communication. I do see here where the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, last week announced plans to build a wall on the southwest border. And I see that the budget request that you submitted has no funding for additional wall construction. Governor Abbott said our efforts will be effective if we work together to secure the border, make criminal arrests, protect landowners, rid our community of dangerous drugs, and provide Texans with the support they need and deserve. This is what he referred to in his statement as an unprecedented crisis. And so in reviewing the request that you have since submitted specifically as it relates to the southwest border, I see as it relates to U.S. Customs and Border Patrol that we're looking at roughly a $1.9 million less this budget year than last. No funding for additional Border Patrol agents or CBP officers, no funding for additional wall construction. I've personally had the opportunity to visit the border to meet with many of our frontline officers who are working extremely hard to contain what I believe is truly a crisis at the border. And so my question is, based upon the previous statements that you've made to this committee, that you've submitted in writing, that you've made to the public, could you please walk me through and explain to me the reason for the decline in CBP's budget request, the lack of additional funding for Border Patrol agents, the lack of additional funding for CBP agents, and the rationale behind no additional wall funding when clearly the governor of Texas thinks that it is very important, to the point that he has already committed $250 million of taxpayer money from the people of Texas to build additional wall funding.
Congressman, let me take a step back, because we take a look at the border as a whole. It is not a one size fits all. The border is very dynamic, and there are different needs and challenges in different parts of the border. Number one, with respect to the brave men and women of the United States Border Patrol, we are very focused on hiring, recruiting, and hiring individuals to fill the vacancies. Number two, we are studying border wall construction. We have already focused on repairing roads and levees where that work is needed. We are looking at particular gaps in the wall and determining what is the best course of conduct to secure our border. And number three, and this is a vitally important consideration, is innovation and technology as the greatest force multiplier in the service of border security. And that has been a bipartisan position ever since I have worked in the Department of Homeland Security. And I am 20 years in to federal service this month, both as a member of the Department of Homeland Security and as a federal prosecutor. And I remember very clearly and very powerfully my meeting with Senator John McCain and his advocacy to me about the need to focus on technology, that the innovations in modern development serve as the greatest force multiplier and have the greatest impact in ensuring our security. And I agreed with him then, and we are executing on that approach now. Not at the expense
Gentleman's
of other.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island for 5 minutes, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. I want to thank you for the important work that you are doing leading the Department of Homeland Security, and I want to recognize the important work by the men and women of the department in keeping the country safe and secure. Mr. Secretary, I want to begin by talking about the scourge of ransomware that is affecting our country, as epitomized by the Colonial Pipeline and JBS attacks. As part of last year's defense bill, we authorized the creation of a joint cyber planning office at CISA, otherwise known as JICPO. And I'm grateful to see the president's budget request funds the office. So JICPO is, which is based on a recommendation from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, on which I have the privilege of serving as a commissioner, will bring together government and private sector entities to coordinate defensive campaign plans. Mr. Secretary, what role do you see for the JICPO in helping us defend ourselves from ongoing ransomware campaigns?
First and foremost, Congressman, just let me thank you for being such a champion of our cybersecurity mission and CISA specifically. I think JICPO is on point for much of the work that CISA needs to do. I greatly appreciate the work of the Solarium Commission. I had the privilege of spending a couple hours with its staff to better understand the details of its work and its recommendation. And I know that the nominee to lead CISA, Jennifer Easterly, who was voted out of committee yesterday, and we're hoping for her swift confirmation, will invest a tremendous amount of focus on JICPO for the very reason you identify.
Thank you. And so I certainly agree that JICPO will be critical in our effort. However, the ransomware problem is immediate and demands immediate action. So, Mr. Secretary, would you agree that that we should convene the interagency and private sector at the JICPO as soon as possible to avoid duplication and duplication of effort and ensure coordination in our efforts?
I most certainly do, Congressman. Thank you. As a matter of fact, my first public remarks on the cybersecurity challenges that our nation faces in February, shortly after I was confirmed and assumed this role, was on the threat of ransomware. The very first 60-day sprint that we embarked upon with CISA was focused on ransomware before the Colonial Pipeline attack, before the attack on JBS. This is most certainly a critical threat that we face on the homeland.
Okay, very good. Well, let us know how the committee can help you in doing that, and let's hopefully we see action in weeks, not months. Mr. Secretary, I want to turn our attention to the issue of systemically important critical infrastructure. I think that the Colonial Pipeline incident has demonstrated how a cyber incident affecting a single company can cause significant consequences for our economy and national security. So do you think that an approach focused on systemically important providers, similar to the Section 9 list from the Obama executive order, is useful to mitigating risk? And will you commit to working with me on legislation to codify a new social contract with systemically important critical infrastructure?
Congressman, I share your focus on critical infrastructure. I know that we across the department, and of course, particularly in CISA, share your concern, and I look forward to working with you on legislation, if indeed that proves to be the best vehicle to bring strength to our focus.
Thank you on that. Last question, Secretary. So I have some concerns about how the Colonial Pipeline incident response was handled in the interagency. I strongly believe that the issue was a significant cyber incident, and we should have seen the stand up of a cyber unified coordination group. Even if the UCG was not established, though, I feel that DHS, as the lead agency for asset response, likely should have coordinated the interagency. I realize that decisions were made were not made by you. So, setting aside this specific incident, can you walk us through what DHS's role normally would be under the PPD 21, PPD 41, and the National Cyber Incident Response Plan?
Let me assure you, Congressman, that we did in fact follow and execute an interagency model. We were in close communication, of course, with the White House, with Ann Neuberger, whose expertise and leadership in this area is so renowned, and deservedly so. I worked very closely with Secretary Granholm. I was linked up with Secretary Buttigieg. We were so closely connected throughout the interagency that I can assure you that that interagency paradigm that we all ascribe to was executed in full.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, Mr. Guest previously made a point of your testimony, bottom of page 2. It says, since April 2020, the number of encounters at the border has been elevated. And just to put a finer point on what he says, here's what elevated looks like. You see that blue line, you're familiar with this, and just for the sake of the committee and members of the public may be looking, that blue line at the top that goes up higher than any other line and then levels out, that's elevated. And by your expectation, last time we were together in March, you anticipated that the highest levels on a sustained basis in over 21 years. Here's another chart of it. This is the Biden administration here. You see what happened in the Trump administration, curtailed, and then this enormous continuing spike. Your understatement suggests that the administration's out of touch with the dynamics of this situation. And also, Secretary Mayorkas, you say in that same statement that the number of encounters has been elevated, quote, due to ongoing violence, natural disasters, food insecurity, and poverty in the Northern Triangle countries. You do know, don't you, that the principal cause of this surge is changes in policy by the Biden administration from the previous administration, and the factors that you cite were prevalent in the Trump administration and prior administrations as well. So that didn't cause the change. Would you agree, sir?
I would respectfully disagree with you, Congressman.
What
We have, those of us who have addressed challenges at the border for many, many years have seen spikes, decreases, spikes again, decreases again. It's a very dynamic situation, and it is overdue that we address the root causes of irregular migration.
Well, you're often talking about what we ought to do. I'm just asking you about the cause as you've deciphered it. And I understand, I'll take your answer that you don't agree with me. When I had 5 minutes with you in March, I asked you whether you expected that the administration's changes in policy would trigger this surge, or you were surprised by that development. And you said that you had no expectation either way, but we did what we had to do. Now, let me say this, I don't know that I had any particular expectation one way or the other. I just knew what we needed to do when we confront a situation, and in fact, we're doing it. But as this has developed, it's true, I've learned, and it's true, isn't it, that the CBP briefed incoming Biden administration officials that the contemplated changes to policy, such as suspending or terminating MPP, would lead to exactly this surge.
Congressman, when I had the privilege of engaging with you back in March, the concern was the overcrowding of Border Patrol facilities.
Yes, sir. I'm not asking you on a different tangent, Mr. Secretary. I'm just asking you whether or not you were briefed that these changes would lead to this type of surge. Yes or no?
if I may, I was
No,
not.
yes or no,
for
sir?
it. I was
Say
not.
you won't answer the question.
If I may have a moment.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Bishop, please allow the witness to answer the question, and you can then follow up.
I'd be glad for him to elaborate, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like him to answer that question.
Congressman, I was briefed on the border situation when I assumed office. In addition, if I may, when we engaged in March, the focus was on the overcrowding of Border Patrol facilities by unaccompanied children. I said then that we had a plan and that we were executing on our plan and that it would take time. The situation in the Border Patrol facilities is drastically different than it was then. In fact, we did execute on our plan.
I'll reclaim my time, of which I've only got about another 30 seconds, Mr. Secretary. Tens of thousands of migrants have been admitted into the country on the premise of having an asylum claim. And I understand that the majority, maybe the vast majority, are determined not to be valid. What is the administration doing to remove from the country those whose claims, asylum claims, have either not being pursued any further or have been determined invalid?
Families, Congressman, who make claims for asylum under the laws of the United States are placed in immigration proceedings to seek to advance those claims. If those claims are granted by an immigration judge, they are granted asylum under our laws. If those claims are rejected by a judge and appeals prove unsuccessful, those individuals are removed from the United States in accordance with law.
Mr. Chairman, in light of my time having expired, I request unanimous consent for the submission of these two charts that I displayed during the testimony. Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's evident that there were multiple failures leading up to and during the siege of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, including the 5 standby responses that the Pentagon relayed to the National Guard during the attack, and the complete and utter failure of both DHS and the FBI in not issuing a threat assessment or joint intelligence bulletin specific to the January 6th joint session of Congress. I know you were not secretary at the time, but the last time you were here, we reviewed your department's failures that allowed a violent mob to ransack the Capitol and depart without being arrested or detained. Can you assure this committee that DHS failure to issue a threat assessment was not part of an attempt by the Trump administration to leave the Capitol and Congress undefended?
Congressman, I am not in a position to editorialize on the actions of or inactions of the prior administration. I am focused on lessons learned and what we can do to make sure that our responsibilities are fulfilled. And in fact, we have taken significant steps in that regard. We issued the first NTAS bulletin in January, the first in quite some time. Since then, we have issued information bulletins to state, local, tribal, and territorial partners with respect to the false narratives that we are observing on social media to make sure that the horrific events of January 6th do not happen again. We certainly have reviewed the events leading up to January 6th. We continue to review those. We continue to draw lessons learned, and we are very focused on the point of your question, which is the critical dissemination of information to equip local law enforcement and local communities in responding to events before or to prevent them and to respond should they tragically occur.
Okay, but wouldn't part of that lessons learned be trying to assess the, the prior administration's lack of response to this? Wouldn't that be part of lessons learned?
Most certainly. And we did note the fact that products were not disseminated as robustly as we have begun to do, and we hope to continue to do.
Okay, you know, we always talk about defending the homeland from, you know, foreign or domestic. And to the extent that we had a rogue administration potentially in the White House, that also has to be assessed, correct?
Well, Congressman, we look at the events. We try to look at them, and we succeed in doing so through an apolitical lens, as I articulated at the very outset. Domestic terrorism we look at in an ideology-neutral fashion. We look at the information that we are receiving, and we ask ourselves, what is its connectivity to violence? What can we do to ensure that communities across the country are prepared, can prevent actions? We work to achieve a partnership with our state, local, tribal, and territorial communities.
And just so we're clear, I'm being apolitical as well. It's not a Republican or Democrat, irrespective of who was in the White House at the time. That assessment needs to be made regardless of party. So this is apolitical for me as well, sir. DHS and this committee have been warning about the threat of domestic terrorism for over a decade now. I know the chairman has been consistent in his concern for this issue, and I've followed his lead as I've come on the committee and learned. As far back as 2009, DHS warned about a resurgence in right-wing extremism.
The gentleman from New Jersey's time has expired.
I will
Recognize
sir.
the other gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you must have noticed, you must feel it, you must see it, that there's a crisis on our southern border. I know that you say there isn't, the administration say that there isn't, but if you speak with, you can feel the frustration of so many Congress people that are even here today questioning you. The bottom line is illegal border crossings that are at 21-year high. Statistics don't lie. The bottom line is you can see the videos, you can visit these sites, you can see the pictures. It's just all there. It's real, and it's not something in the past. Frankly, I don't even want to talk about the past. I want to talk about what's happening now. You know, over 150,000 people a month. And the children, somebody mentioned what a wonderful job we're doing with the children. Well, let me tell you what's happening to children. Children are being abused as they cross the border. Children are being abused before they get to the border. They're being used as drug mules. They're being sexually abused. So are women and families. I mean, this is horrific. It's inhumane. It's wrong. I feel like I'm in a bizarro world when we say that it doesn't exist. It does. We can see it. You can go there. You can look at it. It is there. It's there now, right now. Our border towns, processing facilities, and the Customs and Border Protection agents are completely overwhelmed. Yet the president's budget proposal has a 0% increase in Homeland Security funding for 2022. And furthermore, and I think this is bizarre to me, the budget does not mention border security. Regardless of your partisan positions on things or anybody's positions on things, and I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but how can you have a budget, a 72-page report, and not mention budget security? Whatever you think about it, we know that something needs to be done. The Customs and Border Protection fiscal year 2022 request is almost $300 million below the 21 level. And there is no call for funding for additional Border Patrol agents or Customs and Border Patrol officers. They are suffering down there. The people who are working there are suffering. The people who live there are suffering. The people in the country are suffering. And quite frankly, the undocumented that are coming across are going through hell in many cases, as I mentioned. We aren't treating children well. The Customs and Border Protection Procurement, Construction, and Improvements account was cut in the president's budget by almost 50% from the 21 enacted level. It's awful. In addition, I'm concerned that the president's budget left out necessary funding for Coast Guard needs, and if we get time, we could talk about that a little bit later. I'm grateful that the budget includes the much-needed recapitalization project for training in Cape May, which is in my district. The budget does little to address the $2 billion backlog in the service currently. We need to address the aging IT infrastructure of the Coast Guard without a doubt. This budget doesn't accomplish that. And it spends so much and it doesn't accomplish that. That's, again, the bizarre, I don't know what other word to use, part of it all. Now, Mr. Secretary, as you know, President Biden issued a proclamation on his first day in office to pause construction of the border wall. Why? I don't know, but he did. And pause the obligation of funds for the wall. The Government Accountability Office issued a report on Tuesday this week suggesting that the Department of Homeland Security submit a timeline to the committee dealing with how DHS plans to obligate its congressionally appropriated funds. This timeline is necessary to ensure that this committee maintains strong oversight over the department and the administration, does not replace priorities established through the legislative process with its own agenda. Will you please commit to providing the committee with this timeline?
Congressman, I have to respond.
Sure, I want you to respond. Mr. Secretary, I want you to respond.
Please allow me to respond to some of your preliminary remarks. They require a response. I share your position that the smugglers and the traffickers who exploit children are heinous criminals that need to be addressed. And in fact, we have a number of law enforcement operations to elevate the attack on those smuggling and trafficking organizations over and above the work that was previously done. Number one. Number two, we are in fact addressing children in a more humane way than was previously the case. In the prior administration, Congressman, unaccompanied children were expelled. We are now receiving those children and assessing the claims for humanitarian relief to which they are entitled under American law. We are no longer expelling those children. Those unaccompanied children.
I don't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Secretary, but yes, after they've gone through hell to get here, after we are not committed to the agreement we had with the Northern Triangle and with Mexico, which was much more secure, they were more secure, our country was more secure. We have less security now than we had then.
Gentleman's time from New Jersey has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes, Mr. Correa.
First of all, let me thank our secretary for being here today, sir. Welcome. Quick question, sir. Under the prior administration, your DHS failed to provide Congress with the 2018 quadrennial, every 4-year Homeland Security Review. This report is important to provide effective oversight by us, Congress, of DHS, and to make sure that your department has the assets, capabilities, budget, and policies to address the evolving threats. Will you commit here, sir, today to deliver Congress, us, the 2022 Quadrennial Homeland Security Report?
We will indeed do so, Congressman.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I want to talk about the border and border patrols. My colleagues have made a good point. We need more agents. And a number of years ago, this committee had hearings on hiring new Border Patrol officers. And back then, the problem was that most recruits couldn't pass a test or meet the qualifications, or most importantly, pass a polygraph test. The Anti-Corruption Act requires a polygraph test for all new CBP law enforcement officers. and I know some vets may be exempt from this, but Mr. Secretary, are we still having the same problems hiring agents?
Congressman, we are very focused on recruiting and hiring Border Patrol agents. We are looking at how the hiring process can be reformed to achieve greater efficiency. Indeed, we are focused on that critical effort.
And sir, let me turn again to the border. I went to El Paso. I took a tour of the area, and I met two young girls there, two refugees, Yuri and Yareli, 2 and 5-year-olds. They were thrown over the border wall by smugglers. In this case, the wall didn't work. They were saved because 2 alert patrol border officers saw them with their high-tech equipment. They were able to detect an intrusion with high-tech equipment. So technology worked. So my question, sir, is this what you have in mind when you talk about your budget and protecting our nation's security? More effective technology?
I most certainly do, Congressman, and thank you both for recognizing the force multiplier that technology is, as well as the extraordinarily heroic work of the United States Border Patrol.
And Mr. Secretary, again, talking about the border and illegal drugs at the border, I agree with my colleagues. Record number of illegal drug seizures at the border. But I would say, sir, that these go hand in hand with a record high demand and consumption for illegal drugs in our nation. Would it be fair to say that our dollars are purchasing more and more illegal drugs? And this is in great part driving the record number of importations and illegal drug seizures at our border.
Congressman, tragically, the demand for narcotics is one of the causal factors. In fact, the data shows that most narcotics are sought to be smuggled through the ports of entry, which is yet another reason why we are focused on innovative technology, which is the greatest tool to interdict the flow of narcotics through the ports of entry.
So more technology, more effective Homeland Security.
Indeed, and with respect to the flow of illegal narcotics, the prior administration failed to promulgate critically needed regulations to implement the STOP Act, and we moved very swiftly in the service of Senator Portman's leadership in that area to implement those regulations. We're very dedicated to that fight.
Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for being here. I look forward to continuing to work with you to secure the homeland. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield.
Gentleman from California yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Norman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Secretary Mayorkas. Secretary, can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you, Congressman.
Have you ever had a medical physical?
Congressman, I have, and that's, of course I have, and that's quite a private question to pose to me.
Do they, when you had the medical physical, I'm not talking about what they found, but did they physically get you in the office, talk to you, see what's going on, and was that effective?
Yes, sir.
Okay, why then would the leader of this country and the vice president not want to go physically, look at the border, talk to the Border Patrol agents that you say you want to try to recruit? Why, if it applies in so many other fields, why does it not apply with this? And in fact, is it fair if you had a doctor that laughed at you, as the vice president did when asked to come to the border? Can you comment on that? Does that make sense to you?
Most certainly, I most certainly can. I consider that question to be quite unfair and disrespectful. And let me be very clear. The president and the vice president have requested and directed me to visit the border, which I have done on multiple occasions. And I'd like to cite to my exchange with Ranking Member Katko with respect to my work as a federal prosecutor and the direction that I provided to state and local law enforcement, to federal investigators to visit particular scenes.
Well,
They directed. I'm sorry, if I may finish.
no, I'm
because
reclaiming my time. You made the
if-
statement. You made the statement.
I'm sorry.
I'm reclaiming my time. You made the statement that my question was unfair. I'm making the statement that your comments are just words and they're very unfair. I ask you a simple question, and I would like for you just to answer simply. Does it make sense for the leaders of the free world to go and to talk to and see what's going on at the border? You didn't answer it with Mr. Katko. And all I'm saying is we don't want words. We want actions. And when you say you're trying to hire Border Patrol agents, where's the money?
We have, Congressman, the funds to hire Border Patrol agents to fill the vacancies, number one. Number two, I am the Secretary of Homeland Security, and it is my responsibility to manage the border at the direction of the President and the Vice President, and I have visited the border on multiple occasions.
Have you talked to the Border Patrol agents?
Have
you talked to the Border Patrol agents?
And number three, and
Have
finally,
you spoken with the Border Patrol agents?
I most certainly have. I most certainly have. And number three, if I may, the Vice President served as the Attorney General of a border state of California, and she is quite familiar with the situation on the border.
But she's laughing at it. She has not been. Hey, I'm reclaiming my time, Secretary Mayorkas. I've got a limited amount of time. She's laughing at it. When you say it's an insult, it's an insult. We're claiming my time for you to say that you're looking at the border wall and looking at it when you're not. What do you have to look at? You're not building it. When you say technology, what I've heard, how effective once the 1 million to 2 million people are in this country illegally, how effective is technology going to be to root them out and to find out who they are when you don't know who's coming in the first place? Simple question. Simple question.
The factual premise of your question is inaccurate.
Okay, so you just the numbers.
And technology is proven to be an effective force multiplier.
How about stopping them from coming in the first place? How about knowing who's coming in the country? Is that not common sense?
It is a multi-pronged effort, and we do that as well.
Multi-pronged. Wow. Multi-pronged. It's like all the other words. It's basically you're not doing anything because the numbers don't lie, Secretary Mayorkas, unless you dispute the 180,000 that came last month as opposed to in the previous administration, 20,000 the same month in 2020. Now, once they're in the country, it's hard to get them back out. The Border Patrol agents we talk with, you know why they're demoralized? They're changing diapers. And you will not take the necessary steps to stop it. You can say you are, but in the 74-page budget this administration's put out, you know how many times border is mentioned? Not once. You know how many times climate is mentioned? 54 times. It's not a priority. I'm just telling you this is a crisis. I would invite you, we're going for a second time. Many have been far more. We're going for a second time. We would invite you to come talk to the agents, see the children that are put with, you got 2- and 3-year-olds.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Slotkin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for joining us today. I'm struck as we head to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, just how different the Homeland issues are from when, DHS was stood up, where most Americans were, worried about threats from foreign actors, from foreign terrorists and attacks on the homeland. Fast forward 20 years, we're talking about cyber attacks, the border, domestic terrorism. It's very different. So what I want to ask is about those pivots to those very different things that are threatening Americans. Particularly on cyber, I would just note it feels like all roads lead back to the Department of Homeland Security, particularly in the last couple of weeks. First, because these attacks have really started to affect the average American. They're affecting our, gas and our meat and our video games. I'm, standing with farmers and they're asking me about cyber security. And you all at CISA are really the 911. You are the 911 call center for cyber attacks on our businesses, on our local governments. And it's critical that you be well-funded and well-staffed and ready to take on that responsibility. Secondly, yesterday in the summit between President Biden and President Putin, one of the big things where the president put down a marker was on this list of 16 different critical infrastructure sectors, and how it was important that the Russians understood that those sectors meant something to us. And so I guess my first question is, can you please tell us how you and CISA are prepared to take on this additional responsibility, particularly since, yes, when it comes to deterring Russian cyber attacks, Chinese cyber attacks, often resilience is the best way to deter future attacks. So tell me about CISA. We are waiting for your questions, your concerns, your asks on money and resources. Tell us what you've done to prepare.
Congresswoman, thank you so much for recognizing the fact that CISA is indeed, as we have termed it, the quarterback of the federal government's cybersecurity efforts. We have requested funding of Congress. We are grateful for the support that Congress has provided. We have champions on this committee with respect to the work of CISA. We received, of course, $650 million already, and we're requesting additional funds. The model that we rely upon and that we are advancing is the public-private partnership. That is what is critical. Not only the partnership across the federal enterprise with respect to all of the government agencies that are invested in and dedicated to this effort, but a partnership with the private sector as well. It is so critically important. That is our focus.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And given that the president put down this marker on these 16 different sectors that I think were identified by CISA, I would really appreciate, I think we all would, if DHS would come back to us in a couple months and give us an update. In those 16 sectors, have the Russians tried to penetrate? Have the Chinese tried to penetrate? Have ransomware groups emanating from those countries tried to penetrate? I think hearing back from you is a real accountability for these nation states that are allowing these groups to muck around with the average American's stuff, the stuff we need. So I'd make that request. Pivoting to the issue of domestic terrorism, you came in front of this committee and talked about how domestic terrorism is now the most significant terrorist threat threatening the average American. And I know the White House just put out their big domestic terrorism strategy. Tell me, that's a hard pivot to go from focusing on foreign terrorism to domestic terrorism. In the brief time that you have left, can you talk to me about, again, how many analysts, what's your budget look like? Tell me how many people and the scope you have working on this threat compared to foreign terrorism, if you could.
Congresswoman, thank you. We will indeed update you in a couple of months as you've requested with respect to the cybersecurity challenge in the 16 sectors specifically. We have created a dedicated unit within the Office of Intelligence Analysis to focus on domestic terrorism. We have focused our efforts on information gathering on intelligence to not only best learn of the threat, but to be able to disseminate information to our state, local, tribal, territorial partners. We have a concerted effort. We created the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership, CP3, to also focus on this effort and to develop partnerships that are so critical to this mission. I would welcome the opportunity, we would welcome the opportunity to provide greater details to you about our intense focus on this mission set, which is quite frankly, as I've articulated previously, the greatest terrorism-related threat that we now face in the homeland.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for coming before us here today. As you may know, in April, Ranking Member Katko and I wrote a letter to yourself and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Becerra, regarding the vetting for sponsors and caregivers of unaccompanied alien children at the border. We have not yet received a response. Can you commit to providing us a response on this within the next week?
Congresswoman, I apologize that if we fail to respond to your letter, and we most certainly will as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
I pride myself on responsiveness, and we have received We have many committees to answer to, and I apologize, and we'll address that immediately.
Thank you. Yesterday, I questioned Secretary Becerra on the vetting required for UACs, and he stated that, quote, "We are not going to do anything that imperils the safety and care of a child. Some of the children are being dropped off over the border wall and have perished, and they're brought here by human smugglers and traffickers. Do you agree that the smugglers put children at risk?"
Most certainly, and that is why we have enhanced our law enforcement efforts to address the smuggling organizations and the traffickers.
So you agree, Secretary Becerra agrees, and I agree that these smugglers and traffickers are putting children in danger. Yet we have seen no action from the Biden administration to disincentivize smugglers from bringing children as young as 1 across the border. If we're serious about protecting children, we need to stop making it profitable for smugglers to bring children into the U.S. Your administration's open border messaging is putting children's lives at risk, and 79,948 children have crossed our southwest border. While I was in the Rio Grande Valley sector earlier this year, Border Patrol agents told me that migrants are paying on average $4,000 apiece to be smuggled into the United States. Human smugglers are openly advertising their services on Facebook, claiming that they can promise a 100% safe journey. These cartels are making billions of dollars smuggling individuals and drugs into our country. Because of this, your agents told me that they feel like we are aiding and abetting transnational criminal organizations, and that the policies of the previous administration were working. If we want to tackle root causes, as the Biden administration continues to state, then we should not be promoting policies that enrich the cartels and lead to worsening corruption in the Northern Triangle countries. Additionally, yesterday, I met with young adults who have come into the U.S. legally with their parents as children on a visa status, but yet these documented dreamers are soon to be deported. I've sponsored a bill regarding this, and year after year, their families have applied for the green card lottery only to be denied. When they contact your staff, they are told that they should get married or leave the country and come through the southern border. They are young adults that are being penalized because their parents did not commit the crime of coming to the U.S. illegally. And it would be incumbent upon you and your staff to address that issue. Finally, I have co-sponsored several bills regarding SIVs, or special interest visas. There is no greater urgency for your department than to bring safely to the United States those who have helped us in Afghanistan during the global war on terror. The situation is becoming increasingly more dire with each day that passes, and with reports that the Taliban has recently closed off access roadways. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran, and I know firsthand that no one wants to see the image of a helicopter leaving a rooftop with people dangling from the footplates. Let us not compound the mistakes of the past with inaction in the present. Can you commit to working with the State Department and Department of Defense with a renewed urgency for evacuating these individuals from Afghanistan?
Congresswoman, yes, indeed, we're very focused on that, number one. Number two, allow me to thank you for your service, which is the noblest thing one can do in one's career. Number three, I share your view of the smuggling organizations, the trafficking organizations, and the harm they caused. It is why it was such a terrible decision for the prior administration to dismantle the Central American Minors Program and eliminate a legal and safe pathway for children to arrive in the United States who have a legitimate claim for relief under United States law.
According
And
to
it
the
is
Border
why
Patrol
we have,
Agent
it is
Secretary
why we have stood
Mayorkas,
up.
of those individuals who come into this country and then go back for their hearing, there is only of 90% who do not go to the hearing, 10% who go to the hearing, that only 10% of those 10% are eligible for asylum. So I thank you for your answers. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentlelady from New York for 5 minutes. Ms. Clark.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to see you again, Secretary Mayorkas. And I applaud your decision earlier this year to require State Homeland Security Program and Urban Area Security Initiative grantees to dedicate at least 7.5% of their award to enhancing their cybersecurity posture. I also understand that the administration is seeking funding for a cyber response and recovery fund. While I support these efforts to provide state and local governments additional resources, I believe we get more bang for our buck investing in efforts to prevent malicious actors from compromising networks in the first place. The ever-increasing number of ransomware attacks has demonstrated that additional support is needed going forward. For that reason, this committee recently passed my legislation, the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act, which would authorize $500 million in annual cybersecurity grants to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Do you agree that the vulnerability of our state, local governments to cyber attacks is a national security threat, and that the federal government should provide a dedicated grant program to strengthen state and local cybersecurity?
Congresswoman, thank you for championing this effort. I do agree that the cyber vulnerability of state and local governments is a homeland security issue across our nation. And I look forward to working with you to see how we can best empower and equip and resource state and local governments, especially those that don't have the education and resources to strengthen their cybersecurity alone.
I look forward to working with you as well, Mr. Secretary. As the chairwoman of the Cybersecurity Committee, I'm extremely concerned about the rise in ransomware and other cyber attacks targeting our critical infrastructure. And I'm concerned that we seem to be to keep relearning the same lessons from each of these attacks. We've asked CISA to do an enormous job, but we've given them next to no regulatory authority over privately owned critical infrastructure, nor do they have sustained visibility into threats on private networks. I'm working on legislation to close both of those gaps. First, by requiring critical infrastructure owners and operators to report cyber incidents to CISA, and second, by authorizing capabilities CISA has built through a pilot called Cyber Sentry, which allows CISA to partner with certain strategically placed critical infrastructure to monitor and detect threats in real time, specifically threats to industrial control systems and operational technology. Would you agree that for CISA to be effective, it needs access to information about cyber attacks and greater visibility around those threats to privately owned critical infrastructure?
I think, Congresswoman, once again, thank you. I do believe that CISA's visibility into what is happening across the country is critical to securing our homeland against cyber attacks. It is why the public-private information sharing architecture is central to its strategy.
Can you give me a sense of how your budget supports those goals then?
So we are very focused on resourcing CISA. We appreciate this committee's and Congress's support of CISA. We have developed teams that most effectively deploy to public entities as well as private entities to assist them in remediation, to assist them in securing their cyber or enhancing their cyber hygiene, working with them to provide tools, education, and our expert resources when they are otherwise ill-equipped to do so. We are very engaged in the partnership. The funding that we have obtained and that we hope to continue to obtain will further resource CISA to deploy those teams across the country because in cyber, as I've said repeatedly, we're only as strong as our weakest link.
Yes, I agree, Mr. Secretary. I just want to say that it's been 6 years since Congress passed the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 to incentivize voluntary private sector participation in information sharing. The fact is, we still aren't seeing the kind of robust engagement we had hoped for. And at some point, we have to go back to the drawing board and to find a solution that works. And I look forward to working with you on that. Mr. Chairman, having said that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Mayorkas, thank you again for coming before the committee today to review the department's budget requests and its priorities. I sincerely appreciate your willingness to answer our questions. In my time today, I wanted to drill down on what I hope is a major priority for the department and the administration more broadly, and that is the U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and ensuring that the safety of our Afghan partners who worked alongside us. We have a moral obligation to protect our brave allies who put their lives on the line for us, and we've been working for months to engage the administration and make sure there's a plan with few concrete results. We certainly recognize the complexity of the withdrawal and understand that there are a lot of interagency components involved, from State Department to DHS, but time is running out, and we're talking about the lives of those who served us that we made a commitment to, and we need to have more transparency and action from the administration beyond ongoing interagency conversations. The current Afghan SIV program cannot move quickly enough to address this challenge, and we need to be developing an evacuation plan for those Afghan interpreters who put their lives on the line alongside U.S. forces. There's a precedent for this in Operation New Life during the Ford administration in 1975. But today it's been consistently unclear who is in charge of this effort and what the obstacles actually are. We'll talk to one department and they'll send us over to another, and again, just this interagency roundabout. I know that you cannot speak for the State Department or Department of Defense or other agencies, but DHS is a part of this interagency effort. So today I want to get clarity on what DHS's roles and opinions are on this matter. So specifically, Mr. Secretary, does DHS have any objections to the Guam option to evacuate our Afghan partners and allow their SIV processing to continue in a safer location than Afghanistan?
Congressman, I share your dedication, as I know my partners across the federal enterprise under the leadership of President Biden share your dedication to ensuring the safety of those who courageously assisted our troops. I need to study the Guam proposal. I know that Guam, of course, is an American territory, and that has implications, but we are focused on this program, and I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you further about it. I share your dedication to it.
I would welcome that, Mr. Secretary. Time is running out here. And I know our staff, talked prior, and so I hope we can get an answer on this quickly because the diffuse claims that there's some issue on the DHS side with having a Guam evacuation relocation plan. To your point, it is a U.S. territory. Making sure that we can do whatever we can to alleviate what concerns those may be. If that is a statutory constraint, we can hopefully work as a Congress expeditiously in order to alleviate that, because I think there is a broad sense in Congress that we need to be doing everything we can to help out our allies. And I understand, having spent time in Afghanistan and also having been aware as a soldier in Iraq of the SIV issues that our interpreters there were facing back under the Obama administration, that things get bad slowly and then all at once. And we need to make sure that we're planning. We need to make sure that we're preparing. And if there are hesitations in the interagency process, I hope that those are brought out into the open, that we can work to remedy and to address them as best as we can. And again, if there are procedural modifications that can be made to alleviate concerns that DHS may have over the Guam evacuation, we are here to review, to try to push forward those legislative options, because doing nothing is simply not satisfactory. And please, Mr. Secretary, consider us a willing and able partner in this, but also one that will be pushing forward to make sure that we are leaving no stone unturned, that we are not taking no for an answer or just a vague concern for an answer, but drilling down, getting clarity, and making sure we're doing everything we can for the Afghans who put their lives on the line for us and are currently in harm's way while awaiting the adjudication of their claims. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Chair recognizes the young lady from New Jersey for 5 minutes, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Mayorkas, for being here. First of all, let me just say that I am encouraged by a number of initiatives that you have advanced today and priorities for DHS. And I'm also very encouraged by your recent administrative actions to improve the protections and the pay for the TSA workers. These actions do represent significant progress towards ensuring that these officers receive the pay, protection, and benefits they deserve. However, they do not place TSA under Title V of the U.S. Code, therefore enabling a future administration to roll back these actions without statutory protection in place for the workforce. Secretary Mayorkas, a few questions to this extent. Would you support the legislative changes such as the passage of Chairman Thompson's H.R. 903, the Rights for the TSA Workforce Act, to build upon the recent actions taken to support the TSA workforce and ensure their performance?
Thank you, Congresswoman. We deeply appreciate Chairman Thompson's leadership in this area, and I know that our subject matter experts are working with his staff to provide technical advice with respect to that legislation.
So I'm going to say possibility you're still examining the implications of it.
Yes.
Thank you. While your announcement included actions to improve the pay for the TSA workforce, it didn't actually place the employees on the general schedule wage system, which would ensure that they were getting regular increases as people working in like jobs in perhaps other agencies. So would you support placing the TSA employees on the GS system that's used by most of the federal agencies in order to align them with pay scales and opportunities akin to those with like jobs in other agencies?
Congresswoman, I would support providing pay that is at least at the level of the general schedule. I know that there are some positions where adherence to the general schedule might have unintended consequences that don't serve the interests of particular employees. So I believe that in my direction internally here in the Department of Homeland Security, I wanted to ensure compensation at least at the level of the general schedule.
Not only compensation, but moving forward, the kinds of increases that happen when you're part of a system. Thank you.
I concur.
Unfortunately, the president's budget request didn't include the funding to implement the changes that you announced. So how do you propose Congress pay for those expensive actions? Would you support ending the diversion of the passenger security fees into the general fund to ensure that those fees go to TSA where they can help pay for these workforce improvements that are so desperately needed?
Congresswoman, I would very much look forward to working with you to review the diversion of those funds and whether, and if so, how best those funds could be used in the service of the compensation of our TSA workforce.
That certainly is the most encouraging answer that I've gotten to this question in quite a while. Last but not least, we're having a lot of discussion about cybersecurity, ransomware attacks on critical pipelines and things of that nature. Would you consider directing TSA and CISA to work collaboratively to issue required cybersecurity standards for all modes of transportation, either through security directives or full notice and comment regulations?
Congresswoman, let me, if I can, cite to the work that CISA performed with TSA. TSA issued a security directive to the pipeline industry in the wake of the Colonial Pipeline attack. That was an example and a terrific model of two offices working together to address one of our critical infrastructure sectors. We are looking at critical infrastructure across the board and how best we can use our administrative tools and our regulatory tools that are resident in different parts of the federal government to bring a cohesive approach to an increased cyber hygiene. It's something I would also welcome discussing with you further.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes, Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I represent Texas' 11th Congressional District, and I, over the past few months, have traveled to all 29 counties. I hold town halls, I talk to law enforcement, and I want to say that the situation at the border is a crisis of epic proportion. The amount of drugs that are entering this country, the human trafficking, the people that are being exploited, it's a complete tragedy and a crisis. Mr. Secretary, when's the last time that you talked to a Customs and Border Protection agent in the El Paso sector or the Rio Grande Valley or any sector in Texas?
I believe, I'm not sure if it was yesterday or certainly within the last few days.
Did they tell
I
you?
speak to, I speak to the border, I speak to the Border Patrol multiple times every week, if not multiple times every day.
And Mr. Secretary, those agents, are they saying the word help to you? Because that's what they're saying to me. Every time I talk to them, and the law enforcement agents in my district are saying that because there's been an abdication of protecting that border, we're having to send DPS troops, National Guard troops down to the border, which is leaving our communities less safe, less secure when we have an immense amount of drugs that are entering. Just 2 weeks ago, Saturday, in one of the most northern most counties of my district, we had 2 high-speed chases, and one of them, the sheriff told me there was an F-350 that was full of 20 illegal immigrants, and the next one, there were 7 in a small sedan. 5 were apprehended, 2 were gotaways, were not apprehended. And in that vehicle, over $500,000 worth of fentanyl, methamphetamines, cocaine, and other drugs. Mr. Secretary, this is a crisis that is hitting my community, and we are not a border district. How are we going to curb the flow of 180,000 folks in May, the amount of drugs and fentanyl that are entering this country, the children that are being exploited? What is our path forward?
Congressman, let me answer that quite precisely. Let me first correct a data error. It is not 180,000 individuals. It is 180,000 encounters. That is an important distinction because we are expelling single adults under Title 42 of the United States Code, and we're seeing repeat offenders under Title 42. So it is not 180,000 individuals. It is 180,000 encounters, and I wanted to make that note. When I was a federal prosecutor in the 1990s,
Mr.
we
Secretary,
prosecuted
I want to know what
smuggling cases that
Mr. Secretary, let me
were
reclaim my time. I'm asking what the plan is.
exactly what we have. Thank you so much, Congressman. Exactly what we have asked of this Congress in the president's fiscal year 2022 budget. Provide us with the funding to resource innovation and technology, which is the greatest force multiplier in the service of security at our borders, both southern and northern.
Mr. Secretary, we are seeing a cut in CBP specific funding. We have a $6 trillion proposal from the president. And meanwhile, every single agent that I talk to, whether it's Border Patrol, ICE, Customs, is saying help. They are asking me for help in technology. Their morale is down. They're not able to do their jobs because the priorities haven't been issued.
They are asking you for help in technology, just as we are asking Congress for help in technology. That is precisely why we are directing our funding request in the service of enhanced technology, the greatest force multiplier to achieve security.
Well, and I don't disagree with that. At one point in time as a senator, as Senator Biden, he said, you can tell me what you value, but show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. And I think that's what we're looking at right now, is that in my district and in Texas, we have a crisis of epic proportion that we don't seem to be able to get our arms around, and the policies that we need are not there to curb that flow. And so when it comes to our budget, when it comes to putting our best foot forward, Mr. Secretary, we are asking and demanding that we stop this mass surge and crisis that is hitting my community and every single other community in the state of Texas and in these border states.
Congressman, we have a strategy. We are executing that strategy. I am confident in the strategy, and I am confident in the proposal that we have submitted to this Congress to best resource that strategy.
Gentleman from Texas, time has expired. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, I'd like to echo the sentiments of some of the others on this committee and say how relieved and reassured we are to have you in this position, especially after the parade of incompetents who've been before this committee over the last 4 years. I'd like to ask you first, though, about the budget that cuts $15.3 million in UASI funding, especially in wake of the attack on the Capitol and with the new emphasis on domestic terrorism that seems to be a bigger threat now than foreign terrorism.
Congresswoman, we are focusing our intelligence and analysis resources on the greatest terrorism-related threat to the homeland, and that is domestic terrorism. We have created CP3, as it is known by its acronym, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership. We have created a discrete unit within the Office of Intelligence and Analysis to focus on domestic terrorism. We are building an IT infrastructure to more ably disseminate terrorism-related information to our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. We are doing so very much in this area, and we appreciate the President's leadership in issuing the national strategy that we are executing on.
Well, I think that's true, but my district is Las Vegas, and we certainly know what the results of domestic terrorism are after the October 1st shooting. And we use those funds in a very effective way through our Fusion Center, which works with your department very closely. And we just hate to see those cut. So I hope that Congress can find a way to restore some of those dollars. And speaking of my district, I would also ask you about temporary protective status. I have a large population from El Salvador in my district, and folks from there and Honduras especially are concerned because they're just on hold. They don't know when that may be extended, what the courts might do, what your department's position is. Could you address that a little bit? Because they can't go home, whether it's a natural disaster or armed conflict or something. And many of them have been here for a long time and their families have grown up here. So could you tell us kind of what you're thinking about a timeline for a decision on TPS?
Congresswoman, I appreciate the question a great deal. We're very closely and intensely studying the country conditions in El Salvador and Honduras and in other countries to determine the status of temporary protected status, TPS, for those communities. We're working as quickly as we can and appreciate the sensitivity and the humanity underlying your question.
Well, thank you. If I can work with you in any way, I'd appreciate that so I can reassure those folks that we have their best interest in mind. One last question. I chair the subcommittee that oversees the Stafford Act, and I appreciate the plussing up of the BRIC program. But one of the things I'm trying to do is to be sure that FEMA has the best personnel possible to carry out some of this mitigation and attempt at resiliency. And I'm trying to get a bill passed that would provide similar employment protections for FEMA reservists like we do for military reservists. And I hope you'll take a look at that and see if we can work together to do that as well.
I very much look forward to doing so, and I'm incredibly excited about our new administrator's leadership, Deanne Criswell, and I'm so incredibly honored to work alongside the FEMA personnel and all of the DHS personnel.
And I've spoken to her about this too, so maybe we can get it moving. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes, Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm from Georgia's 9th District. Mr. Secretary, I sent a letter back on March the 31st to DHS and requested some information about the need to expand detention capacity. In response to that letter, the department says, when I asked, when did the government identify the need to expand detention capacity? The response was, after January 21, the Department of Homeland Security observed an increase in irregular migrant flows to the southwest border. It further goes on to say, the projected encounters for fiscal year 2021 are expected to be the highest number observed in 20 years. This is from your own agency. And then in response to question 4, DHS has experienced an increase in irregular migrant flows to the southwest border, and projected encounters for fiscal year 2021 are again expected to be the highest number observed in over 20 years. Do we have a crisis at the border, Mr. Secretary?
I have previously articulated many times that, as has occurred in the past, we have a
Just,
challenge.
yeah, yes or no is sufficient, sir.
We have a challenge at the border. And
Do we have a
a
crisis at
strategy.
the border, sir?
I do not agree with the use of that terminology, as I have articulated before. We have a strategy. We
Well,
are
I think
executing on our
we do,
strategy,
Mr.
and I
Secretary.
have confidence in our strategy.
Now, along with this letter, I asked about a $86.9 million non-compete contract that was given to Family Endeavors by Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And do you agree that the federal government should be the best possible steward of taxpayers' money?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, this $86.9 million non-compete contract requested 1,239 beds beginning March the 17th through the end of September 2021, which was 197 days. So if you take 1,239 times 197, that's 244,000 beds for $86.9 million. That's $356 a day per bed. Does that sound excessive for a hotel?
I cannot judge from my position, Congressman. I think you're well aware of the fact that it would be impermissible for the Secretary of Homeland Security to involve him or herself in the contracting process. I know if I may finish, I know that contract is actually.
Let me reclaim my time. Okay, I think this is excessive. That's way above the government rate, and it does not sound like a good use of government resources to me.
I know that contract is under review, Congressman.
Okay, well, according to this letter, it says ICE actively engaged in market research utilizing techniques set forth in the FAR, contacting knowledgeable individuals within the government and industry, and conducting interchange meetings with potential offerers. Would you agree today to provide us a copy of your market research and the list of potential offerers with which DHS met, including the times and dates of those meetings?
I know that contract is under review, and I will relay your request for information to my team, Congressman. We pride ourselves on responsiveness.
Okay. You know, this letter states the reason for this non-compete is unusual and compelling urgency. They used an expedited contracting authority to respond to the immediate and unusual situation along the southwest border. You know, that says crisis to me. It also says this is the first contract that ICE has awarded to Endeavors. The very first contract, yet it says Family Endeavors is the only known source that is presently capable of meeting the federal government's urgent requirement to provide 1,239 hotel beds in an all-inclusive emergency family residential services to support the federal government's response. How in the world does ICE know that they are the only known source when they have never awarded a contract to Family Endeavors before?
Two comments, if I may, Congressman. First, I must repeat that contract is under review. And
okay, all right, thank you. I've got another question for you on a different subject. Is the federal airline mask mandate a federal law?
It is a federal mandate.
So it's not a law?
I actually don't know the answer to that question, Congressman. I know it is a mandate, and we have the legal authority to issue, if I may answer, Congressman, we have the legal authority to issue mandates.
Okay, all right, that's fine. So, Dr.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Mayorkas, I was pleased this week to see the White House release the first ever national strategy for domestic terrorism, and that the strategy places a particular emphasis on addressing the racism, bigotry, and religious hatred that has fueled a great deal of domestic violent extremism. Even before the pandemic, communities in my district and across New York were reeling from a spate of anti-Semitic attacks, and things have only worsened as extremists and conspiracy theorists spin lies about Jews spreading the virus or controlling our elections. Just last month, a young man from my district, Joseph Borgen, was the victim of a anti-Semitic assault on the streets of New York, which was videotaped and went viral, in which he was punched, kicked, pepper sprayed, and assailed with ethnic slurs. Tragically, the Orthodox community is an easy target for violence because they wear such visible markers of their faith. How will President Biden's national strategy protect the Orthodox community and other targets of violence motivated by religious hatred?
Congresswoman, I very much appreciate your question. I should answer it first on a personal note. My maternal grandfather lost 8 brothers, a sister, and his parents to anti-Semitism executed by the Nazis in World War II Europe. That issue has deep and profound resonance for me. Under the president's leadership, we have invested considerable resources in educating faith-based communities, including the Orthodox community, with respect to the rise of ideologies of hate and their connectivity to violence. We have resourced a grant program in that regard, and we
Well, I
have
wanted to talk about that, if I could, Mr. Secretary. The nonprofit security grant program, which provides funding for physical security enhancements for houses of worship, as you know, is one of the most important resources available to vulnerable communities and nonprofits. And while I'm grateful that that program has delivered millions of dollars to New York and Long Island, my colleagues and I have heard from Jewish and interfaith organizations that present funding levels are insufficient to meet current needs. So Representative Ted Lieu of California and I recently wrote to the House Appropriations Committee, Homeland Security Subcommittee, to request $400 million of funding for this program in fiscal year 2022. So I'm hoping that that is going to be responded to. And I have a short amount of time, and I just want to move on to the issue of border waiver authority. I was glad to see that President Biden's budget requests no funding for border wall construction and instead focuses on investing in effective and modern methods of securing the border and addressing the root causes of migration. This stands in stark contrast to the previous president, whose budget requests reflected a very narrow-minded view of immigration and redirected billions of dollars to the misguided border wall at the expense of public safety and the mission of DHS. While I'm glad that our country is moving in the right direction, I do believe we need to learn from our past and correct loopholes in our law where we find them. Now, as you know, 2/3 of land on the southern border is owned by private citizens or the border states, and much of it is home to sensitive wildlife and wildlands. So in order to construct his wall across this land, President Trump relied on both eminent domain, in which the government seizes land from citizens, and DHS's waiver authority, which allows the secretary to waive environmental and preservation laws in support of border wall construction. Now, the former administration's abuse of the waiver authority led to destroying habitats for at-risk species. It undermined the public's trust in government and was particularly harmful to tribal nations whose sacred lands cross the southern border. So last Congress, this committee passed my bill, the Rescinding DHS's Waiver Authority for Border Wall Act, which would have repealed the Department of Homeland Security's ability to waive any and every law with the stroke of a pen. Do you agree that you and your successors should not have unchecked authority to waive critical public health and safety laws, including the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Clean Water Act for wall construction? And how is the Biden administration going to work to rebuild these habitats and rebuild trust in the U.S. government?
We are very committed to environmental protection. Any waiver authority that we would exercise would only be compelled by circumstances that include an evaluation of environmental impacts. And I look forward to working with you on that legislation, Congresswoman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Since January 2021, there have been over 700,000 illegal crossings across the southwest border, a 21-year high that you, in fact, predicted. This month, the Biden administration officially rescinded the migrant protection protocols. And I want to ask you about that. But first, my home state of Texas passed $1 billion in taxpayer dollars because the federal government is failing to step up to the plate. Texas has had to take this crisis in its own hands. The governor talked about spending now $250 million to begin border wall construction and is now taking donations. Are you, sir, prepared to, it is a federal responsibility, the border, not a state. We all understand that. Are you prepared to reimburse Texans for their border security expenses?
Congressman McCall, it's good to see you again. It's been a
You
while since we worked together when you were chairman of the committee and I served as the deputy secretary. I believe it is indeed a federal responsibility. We are fulfilling that responsibility. We are executing our strategy, and we will continue to do so.
Well, it is a federal responsibility, and it, at some point, the federal government needs to pick up the cost and the tab on this. With respect to migrant protection protocols, I've been I have been very harsh in my criticism of the rescission of Remain in Mexico and the asylum cooperation agreements with Central America. I think that was a foreign policy masterpiece by the Trump administration and a foreign policy blunder by the Biden administration, which has created this self-inflicted wound, which opened up the border to the traffickers. The traffickers are the ones winning here, not the children, for sure. And now we'll probably see 1 million come into this country, along with all the drugs, including fentanyls, which are now killing people, not only in the Northeast, but in my home state of Texas. I've seen many deaths take place, and the apprehensions are going up. What is your plan to deal with this migrant surge? I know you went down to Mexico, but please tell me you're negotiating with Central America and Mexico. You can call it whatever you want, but some agreement with them to stop this crisis that we're now in.
We have a multi-tiered strategy, Congressman, as I think you well know. One, we are addressing the root causes of irregular migration that have persisted for quite a number of years, peaks at several times. You and I worked together to address peaks over the many years, number one. Number two, we are building legal pathways, alternatives to irregular migration, so people don't have to take the perilous journey. We're rebuilding and expanding the Central American Minors Program, building processing centers in the countries of origin. And third, we are indeed addressing the tools that we have to bring consequences to bear when individuals seek to avoid detection.
If I can reclaim my time,
addressing the smuggling organizations.
I know it's called Closer to Home in Guatemala. I talked to the ambassador a lot, and that's great to have these processing centers. But until you change these policies that were rescinded, the traffickers are not going to choose those centers. They're going to choose to make 15 million a day and $500 million a month by taking these children on this dangerous journey. I would ask that you, as I know you are, work with the State Department. We have the Development Finance Corporation. When I talked to the Guatemalan ambassador, he says, I don't really want aid, I want trade. He wants private investment in Central America. We created, and statutorily into law, the Development Finance Corporation. And there are other avenues as well to work with the private sector to get private investment in Central America, because it's one area where you and I agree on this one, is that until we fix that, we're going to continue to have a migration problem. So I hope you can work with
Gentleman's
the
time from
State Department
Texas
in fixing this.
has expired. Chair recognizes this gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes. Chair recognizes Ms. Dimmons from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Mayorkas. Thank you so much for being with us. It's great to see you and to have you in your position. I am very pleased to see the administration's announcement of the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism this week. As you know, we all must, especially on this committee, be truthful about the threats we face. And it is clear that domestic terrorism is an urgent threat the United States faces today. While we in Congress survived the attack on our Capitol, everyone, as you know, Mr. Secretary, did not. And we should do everything in our power to thoroughly investigate it and ensure that while we are here doing the people's business, that we, our staff members, and the people who work in this building are safe. And how can we forget the law enforcement officers who were beaten down that day and gave all they had to, as they say, hold the line? I appreciate the work the administration is doing to have FEMA assist state and local governments combat domestic terrorist threats in their communities. This year, the notice of funding opportunity for fiscal year 2021 for FEMA State Homeland Security Grant Program and Urban Security Grant Initiative included domestic terrorism as a new national priority. Secretary Mayorkas, can you explain the significance of this change in the Homeland Security grant programs and how you think its impact will be?
Congresswoman, thank you so much for your focus on this a critical area. As I've mentioned, it's the greatest terrorism-related threat that we face on the homeland. We require grant recipients under the program that you identified to dedicate at least $77 million to this effort. And we believe that the greatest utility, the most effective measure, is to build partnerships to equip local, state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement agencies to understand, to receive, to understand, and actionalize the information they receive with respect to threat streams, and to build programs of partnership in the communities in which they reside to protect us, to be able to identify individuals who are exhibiting signs of radicalization and intention to commit violence, and to prevent it before it occurs.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for that. But by the same token, as the chair of the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery, I am greatly disappointed to see that the department proposed a decrease of $15.3 million to the Urban Area Security Initiative Grant Program, one that I, as a local official, local police chief, certainly depended upon. The department's budget justification states that the proposed reduction will have a minimal impact on accomplishing the goals of URASI. Mr. Secretary, how did the department engage jurisdictions, local law enforcement organizations, and emergency managers to determine that a $15.3 million cut would have a, quote, minimal impact on accomplishing the goals of URASI?
A three-part answer, if I may,
Yes.
Congresswoman, and certainly I recognize your distinguished service as a chief of police before becoming a member of Congress. Number one, I immediately halted when I came to office a significant diversion of UASI funds that was planned by the prior administration. Number two, we have shifted a focus from developing capacity to sustainment to now being able to address emergent threats for precisely the reason that your first question underscores. And third, we are working very closely with state and local law enforcement to analyze the grant formula that underlies the UASI program and make sure that it addresses the needs most effectively of the entire first responder community.
Mr. Secretary, I am out of time. Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. This is Congressmember Berrigan, who will take over chairing as the chairman has gone to the floor to vote. We next have up Representative Gardino. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I have a question regarding President Biden's recent cybersecurity executive order. It gives CISA a lot of, gives them a lot of responsibilities and has several requirements for them. And while we're supportive of these steps, the budget does not request additional funding for CISA to carry this out. Is there a reason CISA is not getting additional funding for all these items that are in the executive order?
Congressman Gardino, we appreciate the additional funding that Congress already has provided. We do seek additional funding for CISA, and we intend to devote all of our efforts to execute on the president's leadership in this area.
But I mean, was there a reason that the executive order and the budget requests were not coordinated more closely?
We do think that the strategy is coordinated very effectively, Congressman, and our teams would be very pleased to meet with you and your staff to ensure that you understand exactly the coordination that we have undertaken.
So you believe CISA has the resources to meet the requirements under the executive order?
We have the resources. We have requested the resources, and we will continue to request the resources to expand on the mission as the threats so compel.
I appreciate that. And I agree with the ranking member that CISA needs to be a much more funded organization and needs to be really the centerpiece of the government cybersecurity, which is why I'm wondering, where is the administration? I know they're currently reviewing and providing comments on some cybersecurity bills that would give the Department of Energy enhanced cybersecurity authorities relating to the energy and pipeline sectors. It's not just the pipeline and energy sectors that's under attack from these cyber attacks. So wouldn't it make more sense for CISA to have the responsibility across the board to be the quarterback and not give DOE enhanced cybersecurity authorities over these pipelines? Because these attacks are not sector specific.
So we've been taking a look at that question. I think the question raises very complex issues that we also would look forward to discussing. I think what we've done in the pipeline arena, in the pipeline sector, in response to the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, speaks of the complexity of the issues. TSA, as assuredly you know, regulates the security of the gas pipelines. In coordination with CISA, issued a new security directive several weeks ago, which required imposed certain obligations on gas pipeline operators, such as identifying a cybersecurity coordinator who would be on call 24/7, such as providing information to CISA upon an attack. And I think this is a very complex area with respect to the role of CISA vis-a-vis regulatory agencies across the different sectors. I'd look forward to discussing that with you, Congressman Gardino.
Yeah, I think we have to, we should definitely, we don't have enough time here today to go over it, but we should definitely work together on that. And I want to change angles here real quick. I was down at the border recently. The Biden administration has reduced the enforcement of Title 42 for UACs. And Title 42 for other adults, I think we spoke to Border Patrol. They said having that, the Border Police having that Title 42 authority right now is extremely helpful in stopping their officers, their buildings from being overrun. If the administration fully revokes Title 42, even though the pandemic is still, we still have a global pandemic and the COVID numbers in Mexico are very high, is there enough funding? is there enough funding for Border Patrol to make sure that that they can deal with the influx of migrants coming across? I mean, they are very concerned about what's going to happen if Title 42 is fully revoked.
Congressman, it is a very important, this is a very important point. Title 42 is a public health authority. It is not an immigration authority. The ability to employ the Title 42 authority is dependent upon the public health situation. It is driven by public health data, not a matter of immigration policy, and that is dictated by law.
But the Border Patrol agents, but the Border Patrol agents still have to deal with it. I mean, they're going to need the resources.
That is correct, and we have a plan, as we have before the pandemic, to address irregular migration in between the ports of entry, absent a public health imperative.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you to the gentleman for your questions. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Secretary, first, thank you for being with us today. And I will just remind my colleagues on the other side who have been asking for this country to open up because there's no longer a health crisis, according to them, that we would continue to encourage the administration to look at Title 42 now that the country is reopening again. I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for all the work you have done at the border and for allowing me to visit the border with you to see the remarkable progress we've seen in having children out of Border Patrol custody as quickly as possible. Under your work and the work of this administration, it has been remarkable to see the hours go down significantly, less than 72 hours, in many cases, 24 hours. So I want to thank you for that. We also heard from colleagues across the aisle about help on the border. And I'm sure that you're aware of this, but happy to report to my colleagues that help is on the way. I had the honor of going down to Flexi in Charleston to provide remarks at a graduation ceremony there for the second class of the Border Patrol Processing Coordinator, which is a position that was created to provide that additional assistance for Border Patrol agents. So they had that extra help to process migrants, to make sure that we are getting them a better care for children and for families, and to allow more agents to remain in the field. So I wanted to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for that. Mr. Secretary, as you know, the Department of Homeland Security is the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country, with more than 60,000 law enforcement officers among its workforce. Additionally, tens of thousands of state, local, and tribal law enforcement officers receive training from one of DHS's components, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers. As I mentioned, I was fortunate to visit the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Charleston earlier this week. This visit reinforced my belief that DHS has the opportunity to be a leader in law enforcement training by prioritizing de-escalation tactics and oversight mechanisms in its standards regarding use of force and ensuring compliance throughout the department. Secretary Mayorkas, what efforts is DHS making to ensure that the department's law enforcement components are prioritizing de-escalation and utilizing proper use of force tactics?
Congresswoman, thank you for your preliminary remarks. We are every day looking at the training that we provide to our law enforcement personnel and ensuring that it comports with best practices as they emerge. And we are very focused on ensuring that FLETC implements those best practices in its training protocols, not only because FLETC imparts expertise, knowledge, and education to federal law enforcement, but also has an important role with respect to state and local law enforcement. And I would be pleased to provide the particulars to you.
Well, thank you. And you kind of read my next question was, what are FLEXI and the department doing to convey these best practices to state, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies?
We work in close partnership with state, local, tribal, territorial law enforcement. I was just in California last week and met with chiefs of police, sheriffs, highway patrol, and spoke about these very issues. We take a very collaborative and communicative approach with our partners in this regard.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I was impressed to see the efficiency of having this law enforcement training center there and so many agencies, I believe over 100, using it and collaborating and working together. I'm also pleased that the chairman of our committee has taken action on this issue by developing language in the DHS reform bill that enhances and expands de-escalation training at the department and prohibits the use of chokeholds, among other reforms. Mr. Secretary, will you commit to working with the committee on enacting and implementing these reforms?
I look forward to doing so, Congresswoman.
Well, fantastic. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary. I see that my colleague, Mr. Torres of New York has joined us. I will now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary. My first question is about the 287G program. As you know, the program grew by 425% during the Trump administration. It has led to the weaponization of local law enforcement against immigrants and their families. It's done incalculable damage to the public trust that lies at the foundation of public safety. Despite promising to end the program, which has been abused by the likes of Sheriff Arpaio, your department has so far kept it intact. So I'm going to ask the same question that I asked several months ago. When do you plan to end the program as the president promised?
Well, Congressman, let me share with you the approach that we are taking. Number one, I should say, is a predicate that change takes time. Number two, it is clear that we need to strengthen and improve our relationship with state and local law enforcement to make sure that it is productive in the service of our mission and in adherence with, and this is critical, our principles and values. I am working with Immigration and Customs Enforcement on new enforcement guidelines, and that I think is the first step necessary as we reform our immigration enforcement system. Number two, an additional point, and I think you, I'm sure, are aware of this. If, in fact, we see the pernicious abuse of a 287G agreement, the mistreatment of individuals in immigration custody, we will act accordingly. And indeed, I have done so. And I specifically and respectfully draw your attention to our actions in the state of Massachusetts, in keeping with the findings of the Attorney General in that state.
You're conducting a review. What's the timeline for the review?
We will move as swiftly as we can. We will.
Do we have something more concrete than as swiftly as we can?
I do not, Congressman. I do not have a more concrete timeline for you.
A question about TPS. As you know, Mr. Secretary, instability in Central America has driven a mass migration to the U.S.-Mexico border. Central America has been hit hard by several hurricanes. According to Oxfam, 2 hurricanes in particular had an impact on 11 million people, causing the evacuation of 800,000. Since environmental disaster is one of the criteria for temporary protected status, are you open to designating Guatemala and redesignating El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua for temporary protected status?
We are looking at the country conditions in the countries that you identified, Congressman Torres. We're studying those country conditions very carefully, and we fully recognize that climate disasters are considered a factor in our review.
Is there a timeline for that review?
We are also moving as swiftly as possible, Congressman.
As you know, Mr. Secretary, there's been a surge in cyber attacks. The law department in America's largest city was struck by a cyber attack. So was the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the largest public transit system in the United States. Are you aware of each of these attacks?
I am.
And since local and state governments and public transit systems have no reporting obligation to DHS when it comes to cyber incidents, how did you find out about these attacks? When did you find out? Did you find out immediately?
Congressman, We pride ourselves on our partnerships with both public agencies across the nation as well as with the private sector. We are looking at reporting obligations, the current architecture. They are voluntary. We're determining the pros and cons of making reporting obligations mandatory, I should say, obliging them. There are both
And
pros
just in
and
the
cons
interest, I just want to quickly, Mr. Sir, I just want to, because my time is running out. Does DHS have the authority to require reporting of cyber incidents as a condition for receiving DHS grants?
I would have to take a look at that precise question as you tie it to grant funding, Congressman.
And stipulate for a moment that you did have the authority. Would you be open to extending reporting obligations to state and local governments and public transit systems that become the target of cyber attacks?
I would like to analyze that issue better. I'm not equipped to answer such a significant question extemporaneously.
I see my time is about to expire, so I thank you for your public service.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's time has expired. I thank the gentlelady from California for stepping in while I went and voted. Thank you much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And good morning, Secretary Mayorkas.
Congresswoman, it's forgive me. I apologize for interrupting. It's a little difficult to hear you.
Can you hear me
I
better
think you
now?
need to turn your volume up.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, yes.
Awesome.
I'll focus even more intensely on
Okay.
on your
All right.
question.
Well, I'll jump right in on the questions and I'll speak as loud as I possibly can. So, Secretary Mayorkas, you would, I'm assuming, certainly agree that border security is under the purview of Homeland Security.
Yes.
Excellent. So, can you tell me what the job description of the border czar is?
Do you mean the Secretary of Homeland Security? My
No,
responsibilities.
I'm referring to the appointment from President Biden to Vice President Harris as the border czar.
Congresswoman, you are speaking with the individual who has responsibility for border security as the Secretary of Homeland Security.
So
the
there's
Vice
a break
President's
then
response.
with the administration. So it is our understanding that Vice President Harris has been appointed by President Biden as a border czar, and so you disagree.
That is a misunderstanding. The Vice President, her focus is on addressing the root causes of irregular migration, working with the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras in the Northern Triangle to understand why people are leaving their home countries, their homes where they speak the language, where they built their lives.
Security of the United States. I understand that I understand where you're going with this, but I'm going to reclaim my time. So I'm just going to redirect. How many agents do we have, Border Patrol agents do we have on the southwest border?
I will provide you with a precise number, Congresswoman. I will provide that to you later today.
As Secretary of Homeland Security, we have a border crisis, and you can't tell me how many agents we have, roughly, approximately, on the southwest border?
Congresswoman, I think you're aware of the fact that the tens of thousands of Border Patrol agents that we have. You're well aware of the responsibilities that they execute and the talent and expertise they bring to the border.
And there's roughly 20,000 for both the north and southern borders on the United States. Can you tell me how many sectors we have in Texas?
I cannot provide to you the precise number of sectors that we have.
Secretary Mayorkas, there are 9 sectors. I'll answer that for you. And in the president's budget, they allocated $9.1 million in coordinators, which will be the equivalent of 125 agents, which are not full-fledged agents. They are transporters for migrants and paper intake folks. But when we have a record number of retirees out of the Border Patrol agents with some of the lowest morale in the country, and 40% of the agents in just the RGV sector alone, one of the highest activity sectors that are seeing the highest numbers of apprehensions and gotaways along the southwest border, 40% of the agents are already doing humanitarian. Do you think 125 agents of coordinators, additional coordinators, is sufficient, given
I
the
can,
numbers?
Congresswoman, if you understand the workforce and its needs.
Secretary, I do not mean to be rude, but just a yes or no will suffice.
No, may I please have the opportunity to answer your question, because this is so vitally important, not only to the execution of our responsibilities, but to the morale of the Border Patrol agents. What we try to avoid is having Border Patrol agents execute mission support responsibilities, and therefore we are hiring, we are recruiting and hiring individuals with different job portfolios, so that those with expertise can actually execute the responsibilities within the parameters of their expertise.
Secretary Mayorkas, I'm not sure what expertise is required to drive a bus or van and to fill out paperwork, but I do think that our full-fledged sworn officers and agents need more support from the administration. Absolutely. I'm going to redirect in the remaining time that I have. As you know, FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program provides federal funds. And I have recently been on an airplane in McAllen, Texas, in which migrants were being flown from on that plane that I was on. And these were migrants that we had picked up the night before. It's my understanding that FEMA is supporting the travel costs of these migrants. Is that true?
Congresswoman, we've brought resources from different agencies to address the security of the border. It reflects our commitment to achieving that security. It is part of our strategy, and we are executing on that strategy. We have dedicated FEMA personnel to the Department of Health and Human Services as well, personnel from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to address the needs of unaccompanied children. It's what you and I spoke of at the last hearing, and I think the progress that, the extraordinary progress that we made with respect to that mission set speaks precisely to what I communicated to you in March, which is we have a strategy,
and
we're
Mr.
executing
Secretary,
our strategy.
I understand that my time has expired. I want to be respectful of the chairman. So I'll take your answer as a yes, that FEMA has been supporting the travel costs of migrants. And I will also submit for the record that once again, the questions that I submitted to the record to you, Secretary Mayorkas, in March have gone unanswered. I will again repeat my request to have your office respond in writing to those requests. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayorkas, I'm submitting for the record a letter from Chairwoman Maxine Waters asking for certain information from your office without unanimous consent for it to be included in the record without objection. I want to thank the Secretary for his testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the Secretary, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The Chair reminds members that the committee record will remain open for 10 business days. Let me thank you again, Mr. Secretary. You have done almost 3 hours, so thank you very much. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.